policy also, when government intervenes, it creates problems that it tries to solve by intervening further. Take Iraq, please. How do we get to the point where the Bush government invaded Iraq? Let's take a trip down memory lane. In 1963, the CIA helped a young Iraqi ally who, along with other plotters, overthrew General Abdul Qasim. You might have heard of this young Iraqi ally. His name was Saddam Hussein. 5 years later, the CIA backed another coup that made Hussein deputy to the new military ruler, and then in 1979, Hussein took his turn as dictator. Saddam Hussein proceeded to wage a long and costly war on Iran. Although many people correctly point to this war as evidence of Saddam Hussein's evil, they rarely mention one highly relevant fact. The Reagan administration supported this invasion with billions of dollars in export credits and with satellite intelligence. Saddam Hussein was evil for initiating and fighting that war. How then should we evaluate the U.S. government officials who actively supported him? But my main purpose here is not to question the morality of war, even though that's worth doing. Rather is to point out how one intervention leads to another. The U.S. government supported a man who eventually took over Iraq's government and who later became, in the eyes of the U.S. government, the enemy. The U.S. government's interventions in the 1960s led indirectly but inexorably to its intervention in the 2000s. Why did the U.S. government support Saddam Hussein in his war in Iran? Anyone know? Yeah.
Oil availability?
No. Iran had, but I'll give someone else another shot. Iran had become an enemy of the U.S. government after the Ayatollah Khomeini and his allies, or he didn't do it, but his allies took over the U.S. embassy. Or after he took over, and the Iranians, the students had taken Americans in the U.S. embassy hostage. One main reason that the Iranians were so upset at the U.S. government was that the CIA in 1953, with Kermit Roosevelt, a relation of Theodore Roosevelt, and Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the father of the guy who later ran the war in Iraq, helped depose the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, and reinstalled the Shah of Iran. The Shah created a secret terrorist police force, SAVAK, that tortured its own citizens and imprisoned political opponents. The CIA helped train SAVAK. On domestic policy, the Shah undertook a highly inflationary monetary policy that caused the value of the Iranian currency to plummet. Inflation and torture, funny how that upsets people. By the way, is there a seat anyone, or do you just stop? President Carter was asked about this. He was president when all this happened. And he was asked, do you think the overthrow in 1953 had anything to do with this thing that happened in 1979? And his answer was memorable. He said that that was ancient history. Let me ask you something. Anyone here take history? Anyone? What's the usual time period for ancient history? 26 years? No, quite a lot longer. It was highly relevant. And the question I always ask American audiences is, imagine someone had overthrown the Obama administration in 2011. Do you think that in 2037 we'd have forgotten about that? I don't think so. Interestingly, when James Woolsey, who was the director of intelligence of the Clinton administration's Central Intelligence Agency, spoke at the Naval Postgraduate School where I teach in August 2003, I asked him a question about the 1953 uprising. During his speech, Woolsey had stated that the war with militant Islam had begun in November 1979 when some Iranians took over the embassy. I asked him whether he didn't think it was about 26 years earlier. when the CIA helped impose insanity. Woolsey laughed and replied that, as Churchill had said, when it came to the Middle East, the Americans, after doing many wrong things, would always end up doing the right thing. In other words, he essentially admitted CIA complicity, but dismissed the idea that that mattered because the U.S. at some point that he did not specify finally got it right. But his answer evades the issue. Did the U.S. government's 1953 actions have bad unintended consequences? And although Reagan finally did the right thing by removing the price controls on oil, going back to our domestic policy example, we're stuck with many of the regulations that those price controls on oil led to, like the CAFE laws. Similarly, the bad consequences of the U.S. government's intervention in '53 have been horrendous and can't be laughingly dismissed. Or, to take a look at even more recent history, look at the unintended consequences of U.S. government intervention in Afghanistan. I'm not talking about 2001, I'm talking about 1980. Although the U.S. government now fiercely opposes the radical Muslims over there, they helped put them in place. In an interview in Naval Observateur a few years ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor to President Carter, bragged about the fact that in 1979 he persuaded Carter to destabilize Afghanistan's pro-Soviet government so the Soviets would invade. He wanted that invasion. And of course he got his Christmas wish, the Soviets invaded in December '79. One other person who helped fund these Muslims, who fought the Soviets, so the Americans funded them, and another person who funded them was Osama bin Laden. Incidentally, after September 11th, the Bush administration was frantically trying to find a link between Osama and Saddam. Here's the link. In the 1980s, both were allies of the U.S. government. Unfortunately, the basic lesson about intervention has not been learned by the people who need to learn it most. That is, the makers of U.S. foreign policy. And I'll say a little later why I think that is. I don't think they have the incentive to learn the lesson. A large number of them still believe that they can design the world in any way they like, and that they can somehow avoid unintended consequences. Or if there are such consequences, they'll be small. And in that sense, they have what Friedrich Hayek, the famous economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1974, called the fatal conceit. Hayek used that term to apply to people who believe governments can plan economies with good results and few bad ones. He never used it to talk about foreign policy, but I think the same principle applies. Now, I want to get to my more narrow topic of the cost of war and who's paying for it in the United States in a few minutes, but I don't want to leave this topic without talking about, quote, why they hate us and what the terrorists are after. First of all, there's good news here. They don't hate us. If you look at the polling data from Arab and Muslim countries, when they're asked what they think of of Americans, a very large percent likes us. If they're asked what they think of the U.S. government, a very small percent likes the U.S. government. They distinguish between Americans and the U.S. government. I wish Americans would make that clear distinction. I wrote a few pieces on antiwar.com titled, "Who is We?" Where people are always saying, we did this, we did that. I was telling some of the guys and gal at dinner tonight that I went into a class of my officers one day and said, we shouldn't be using the word we to talk about the U.S. government. People say, we invaded Iraq. I didn't invade Iraq. Some of them did. In the class, I pointed that out, but I didn't. And so really, the people in that part of the world who like Americans a lot and dislike the U.S. government a lot, as I point out in this speech I gave in Dallas a few months ago, they're a lot like me. And I want to just quote from one of the terrorists recently, the Times Square bomber, Faisal Shahzad, because he really pushed the judge, Miriam Cederbaum, to let him speak before she's sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but here are two interesting parts of what he said. This is from him talking in court. It's a transcript. The crusading U.S. and NATO forces who have occupied the Muslim lands under the pretext of democracy and freedom for the last 9 years are saying with their mouths that they are fighting terrorism. I say to them, we don't accept your democracy nor your freedom because we already have Sharia law and freedom. Furthermore, brace yourselves because the war with Muslims has just begun. Consider me only a first droplet of the flood that will follow me.